The morning light came soft and gold through the windows of Maggie's diner, catching the steam rising from cups of black coffee and making the Formica countertops shine like they were new again. It was the kind of place you only found in towns like Elkwood, Idaho, quiet, tucked away in the folds of the mountains, where time seemed to stretch itself out like an old hound dog on a porch. Folks here didn't rush. They talked slow, listened deep, and remembered everything. At a corner booth, where the vinyl had cracked just enough to show its age, sat Walt Briggs. Folks around here just called him Walt. 78 years old, long retired from the Elkwood Volunteer Fire Department, he wore the same faded denim shirt every Wednesday and the same soft smile every time someone asked about Sadie. Walt had that look of a man who'd carried weight and laid it down slowly, year by year. His hands were big and lined, the kind that had once pulled people from burning homes and patched up roofs before the rain came in. His back was stiff now, and his knees complained, but his voice? That still held its shape, calm, low, a little rough around the edges like gravel under tires. This morning was no different. The regulars had gathered. Old Ed from the sawmill, Preacher Donnie, and Martha, who made the best peach preserves this side of Boise, were sipping coffee nearby. Walt stirred a little creamer into his cup, looked up from the swirl, and said, "You ever hear about the fire out on Ridgeway Lane? Must have been 15 years ago now. Maybe 16. They leaned in. They'd heard some version of the story before. Walt had a way of drawing people in, but they never minded hearing it again. Especially when it came from him. There was a boy in that house, Walt continued, his voice growing softer, almost reverent. No one knew he was there. Fire already went up the front porch when we got on scene. Whole place lit up like a matchbox." He paused, sipped his coffee, let the silence hold for just a second longer than usual. "And my dog. Sadie, she knew." Someone in the diner let out a soft hum, not quite a word, more of a sound people made when they were listening with their hearts. Walt smiled a little, looking out the window like he could see that smoke still hanging over the valley. "I reckon she saved that boy's life," he said. "She didn't hesitate. Not once. I've known good men freeze in a fire, but not Sadie. She just went." Outside, a breeze rustled the pine trees that lined Main Street. The sound was like a whisper. Inside, all eyes were on Walt. "I'll tell you the whole thing," he said, setting his coffee down. "If you've got a little time." And in Elkwood, Idaho, they always had time. Walt first met Sadie on a damp spring afternoon, the kind where the clouds hung low and the air smelled of wet dirt and lilacs. He hadn't been looking for a dog, not really. Station 9 had just lost their old search hound to age and illness, and there was talk of letting the position go vacant. But Walt, who had seen how much a good dog could do in the field, wasn't ready to let that go. He drove 3 hours to a rescue kennel outside Boise, thinking maybe he'd find something useful, a half-trained shepherd, maybe a retriever with the right temperament. Instead, he found a wrinkly, long-eared bloodhound pup with paws too big for her legs and a bark that could rattle a truck door. "She's trouble," the woman at the shelter warned. "Stubborn, loud, chews on everything that ain't nailed down. But smart, too smart." Walt had chuckled. "Sounds like half the guys I've worked with." He named her Sadie right then and there. Training her was no picnic. She hated leashes, loved mud, and had a nose that led her into every ditch and culvert in the county. But there was something in her eyes, warm, amber-colored, with a kind of thoughtful calm beneath the mischief. She listened when it mattered. And when they trained in smoke houses or ran drills in the woods, Sadie didn't just follow commands, she anticipated them. Walt remembered the first time she found a mock victim buried under half a cord of firewood. She sniffed once, twice, then gave a single, low bay that echoed off the trees like a church bell. He hadn't needed a stopwatch to know she was fast. He just looked at her and grinned. "You're gonna save somebody one day, girl," he told her. And she did, more than once. They became a unit, him and Sadie. Wherever he went, she followed. Around the firehouse, she was part shadow, part mascot. The rookies called her Deputy Sadie, and no one objected. She'd curl up by Walt's boots during slow nights and sit alert beside him in the rig when the tones dropped. Walt, who'd never married and whose closest kin lived 3 states away, came to think of Sadie as something more than a partner. She was company in the silence, reason to get up on cold mornings. She didn't care if he came back with soot on his coat or sorrow in his bones. She'd meet him at the door with that same gentle thump of her tail and a look that said, "You're not alone." In Elkwood, where winters could feel endless and fire calls were fewer every year, Sadie kept him steady. She was the one thing he hadn't known he needed, until she arrived and made everything feel just a little less heavy. And in time, folks said they started to walk the same way, slow, deliberate, always ready. It was one of those late summer evenings when the heat clings to your skin like a second shirt, and the air feels so dry you'd swear it could crack. Walt remembered it well. The kind of evening when thunder rumbles but no rain comes, and the lightning flashes sharp and fast, angry, without purpose. They call it dry lightning out here. Pretty to look at, deadly when it hits. The call came in just after 9 p.m. Old farmhouse on Ridgeway Lane, a few miles out past the river bend. Neighbors said it was likely empty. Family had gone to visit relatives in Boise that weekend. No cars in the drive. No lights in the windows. Most figured it'd be a simple containment job, cool the hot spots, keep the wind from pushing it toward the woods. Walt wasn't so sure. The clouds were hanging low that night, heavy like the sky was holding its breath. He and Sadie rode out in engine 2 with the rest of the crew, the road winding through fields that shimmered with heat. When they got there, flames were already curling up from the front windows, licking the shingles like hungry tongues. The air stank of burning insulation and scorched pine. "Stay sharp," Walt had told the crew. "Fire like this, even an empty house can bite you." They started their sweep, standard protocol. Walt held Sadie's lead loose in his left hand as they moved around the perimeter, checking entry points. But something was off. She was pulling hard, snout low to the ground, nose twitching in short bursts. Then she whined. A sharp, anxious sound. Not fear, urgency. Walt stopped. "Easy, girl. What is it?" She turned toward the side of the house, then back to him. Her eyes locked onto his like she was trying to speak. Another whine, louder now. She started tugging the lead again, toward the back door this time, the part of the house where smoke was pouring thickest. "Cap," Walt radioed to the incident commander, "we might have something." Sadie's keyed in on the west side. Requesting interior entry. There was a pause on the other end. "Copy that. Proceed with caution." Walt kicked the door in. The heat hit him like a slap, thick and punishing. Smoke coiled low along the ceiling. The structure was already groaning, wood beams crying out as the fire worked its way through the bones of the house. Sadie hesitated just a second, then bolted, dragging Walt forward with startling force. "Sadie, hey," he shouted, coughing as the smoke clawed at his throat. But she didn't stop. He could barely keep up, stumbling over scattered toys, a tipped-over chair. The fire roared behind them, walls glowing like the inside of a furnace. He couldn't see her now, only hear the slap of her paws on the linoleum, the low, determined sound of her breathing. Somewhere inside all that chaos, Sadie was leading him somewhere deeper. And Walt knew, in his gut, that something, or someone, was still in that house. The heat was unbearable now, thick enough to feel in his lungs, in his bones. The air crackled, every breath tasting like ash and metal. Walt stumbled after Sadie, crouched low with one arm across his mouth, his fire coat soaked in sweat. The hallway warped with smoke and rising heat, walls breathing in and out like a living thing ready to collapse. But Sadie didn't stop. She darted to the left, past a scorched family portrait still clinging stubbornly to the wall, and came to a halt outside a narrow hall closet. Her front paws scratched frantically at the door. One deep bay, a sound Walt had learned to trust more than most people. It was her signal. She'd found something. Walt threw the door open. There, curled small and still as a whisper on the closet floor, was a little boy. Couldn't have been more than 8, his face soot-streaked, blonde hair plastered to his forehead, arms wrapped tight around his knees. He looked like he'd just fallen asleep. But Walt knew better. "Tommy," he breathed, checking for breath. "They're shallow, but there." The boy was alive. Unconscious, but alive. "Hold on, kid," Walt muttered, scooping him up as gently as he could. The boy's body was warm, too warm. Smoke inhalation. Minutes mattered now. Seconds, maybe. "Sadie, go!" Walt barked, coughing hard. "Lead us out." She turned instantly, retracing her steps through the thick, boiling dark. Walt followed, shielding the child's face with one arm, the other steadying himself on the wall as the building groaned overhead. The hallway behind them collapsed with a thunderous crack, flames bursting through the roof above like the exhale of something ancient and angry. "Keep moving, girl," he urged, though his legs burned with every step. They reached the kitchen, half of it already caved in. A beam crashed down behind them, sending sparks into the air. Walt didn't hesitate. He ducked low, sprinted where he could, climbed where he had to. Sadie leapt over burning debris like she'd rehearsed it, her ears flat, eyes sharp, smoke clinging to her coat. Just as they reached the back door, the ceiling gave way with a deafening roar. A spray of embers rained down. Walt felt the heat claw across his neck, a burst of pain as fire caught the edge of his collar. Sadie yelped as her flank was grazed, but she didn't stop. They burst out into the night. Walt collapsed onto the lawn, cradling the boy in his arms, sucking in the cool air like it was water. The rest of the crew was rushing toward them now, shouting, eyes wide in disbelief. Paramedics swarmed in. "He's breathing," Walt croaked, barely able to speak. Sadie sank down beside him, chest heaving, her left side singed but her eyes alert, focused on the boy. Even through the smoke and the chaos, her tail gave a slow, tired wag. Tommy lived. And in the heat of that fire, under the weight of smoke and fear, a dog had found him when no one else could. The next morning, Elkwood woke to the kind of stillness that only comes after fire. The Ridgeway house was gone, reduced to blackened timber and whispers of smoke curling toward the pale sky. But the town didn't talk about the loss. They talked about the boy. And the dog. And the man who followed her into the flames. At the clinic on Main Street, Walt lay propped up on a stiff cot, his left arm wrapped in gauze and the skin along his neck pink and raw. The burns weren't deep, but they hurt something fierce. Still, he didn't complain. Not once. His eyes stayed mostly on the kennel crate at the foot of his bed, where Sadie lay dozing, her side shaved and bandaged, a fan gently whirring nearby. She had a nasty burn down her flank, but the vet said she'd heal fine. "Tougher than most dogs I've seen," Dr. Langley muttered, shaking his head. Or people, for that matter. Walt gave a soft chuckle. "Yeah, that's my girl." Word traveled fast in Elkwood. By noon, the waiting room was full, not with emergencies, but with neighbors. Some brought food. Others just came to sit for a while, offering quiet words and full thermoses of black coffee. Someone dropped off a quilt with Sadie's name stitched in the corner. And sure enough, by the end of the day, the bulletin board outside the diner was covered in cards. Walt's favorite was from little Ellie Thomas, who drew a crayon picture of Sadie wearing a superhero cape. Underneath, in crooked handwriting, she'd written, "Thank you for being brave." Tommy's parents visited that evening. The boy was still in observation at St. Luke's in Boise, but he was going to be okay. They said he was minutes from dying, his mother said, voice breaking. "If you hadn't found him." "We didn't find him," Walt corrected gently, nodding toward Sadie. "She did." Tommy's father crossed the room, his face pale and weathered from sleeplessness. He extended his hand, then pulled Walt into a firm, silent hug. No more needed to be said. That night, as the stars came out over Elkwood, Walt sat by Sadie's crate with the door open. She rested her head on his boot, too tired to lift it higher. He ran his hand gently over her ears, careful not to touch the bandage. "You saved that boy, girl," he whispered. "Don't think they'll ever forget it." "I know I won't." She let out a soft breath, her tail thumping once, just once, against the side of the crate. And though he'd never admit it aloud, Walt's eyes stung a bit as he sat there in the soft clinic light. Because in all his years of service, through all the fires he'd walked into, he'd never witnessed anything quite like what Sadie had done. And neither had Elkwood. 15 years can pass in the blink of an eye, especially in a town like Elkwood, where the days roll easy and the mountains don't much change. But for Walt Briggs, those years brought quieter mornings, slower steps, and the bittersweet passing of time. Sadie lived for 5 more good years after that fire. Her limp never quite went away, and the gray settled early in her muzzle, but her eyes stayed bright, and she kept her place by Walt's side until her last breath. The whole town came out for her memorial. Folks brought flowers, firemen lined the sidewalk in uniform, and someone played taps on an old trumpet. They buried her just behind the fire station, beneath a pine tree that leaned slightly west, like it too was paying its respects. Walt never got another dog. Said there wasn't room in his heart for second best. He'd gotten a few letters over the years from Tommy's family. A Christmas card now and then. A photo of the boy at his middle school graduation. One year, a typed note came in the mail with a return address from Chicago. Tommy had written it himself. "Mr. Briggs, thank you for saving my life. I still think about that day, even if I was too young to remember all the details. Mom tells me about your dog Sadie all the time. I want you to know I've decided to join the fire academy. I hope I can be brave like you two were. Sincerely, Tommy Gallagher." Walt kept that note tucked into his wallet, folded and worn at the creases. And then one autumn afternoon, just as the leaves were starting to turn, Walt got a phone call. There was to be a ceremony in Elkwood, a dedication at the new town green outside the firehouse. The mayor's office asked him to be there. They were unveiling something special, but wouldn't say more. Walt showed up in his Sunday best, the same charcoal gray suit he wore for weddings and retirements, with his old department pin still clipped above the heart. And standing there on the grass was Tommy Gallagher, tall now, broad-shouldered, dressed in the uniform of an Idaho state firefighter. A man full-grown, but with the same eyes Walt remembered behind the smoke. "Mr. Briggs," he said, offering a firm handshake, "it's good to finally meet you like this." Walt smiled, that same soft crinkle in his eyes. "Didn't expect you to get so tall." Tommy laughed, then stepped aside and motioned toward the covered figure behind him. With a nod to the crowd, he pulled back the cloth. It was a statue, bronze, full of motion and life. Sadie, mid-stride, her nose to the ground and ears flowing like wind, carved as if she were on the trail once again. Beneath it, a plaque read, "In honor of Sadie, for the lives she found and the love she gave." Walt didn't speak. He just reached out and touched the cool bronze, his fingers lingering on the shape of her ears. For a moment, time folded in on itself. And Sadie, brave, loyal Sadie, was right there again. The ceremony had ended, the crowd had drifted off in pairs and small groups, and the laughter and polite conversation had given way to the hush of early evening. Elkwood had a way of going quiet when the sun started to slip behind the pines. It didn't feel lonely, it just felt still, like the world taking a deep breath. Walt remained by the statue, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched in that familiar way of older men who've carried more than their fair share. He looked up at the figure of Sadie, ears perked, body caught in that eternal pose, and something in his chest ached in the most tender way. He hadn't cried during the dedication. He didn't do much crying in public anymore. But standing there alone, with the wind tugging gently at the hem of his jacket and the smell of burning leaves somewhere nearby, Walt let himself remember. He remembered the weight of Sadie's body in his arms that last day, the slow weakening of her breath, the way she rested her head against his knee like she knew it was time. He remembered those early mornings when she'd ride shotgun in the engine, nose pressed to the window, ears flicking at every sound. And he remembered the way she'd wake him with a single nudge when the nightmares from old fire calls stirred him awake. "Funny thing," he murmured aloud, not to anyone in particular. "You spend a life doing something, fighting fires, saving folks, and it's not the fires you remember. It's the dog who sat beside you when it was all done." He looked over toward the firehouse, now quieter than it used to be. Most of the men he'd served with had moved on, retired, or passed. New kids ran the place now. Good ones, sure. Smart, quick. But they hadn't known Sadie. Not really. He chuckled under his breath. She used to bark at the rookie if he didn't tighten the hose coupling. Had more sense than half the crew. The wind stirred again. This time, it carried the sound of children playing in the distance. Life was moving forward, as it should. That's what Sadie had given him, he thought. Not just memories or medals or the story folks like to retell around town. She gave him a reason to keep going when the job got too heavy, when the nights got too long. Walt took a slow breath and looked up at the mountains beyond the treetops, the sky now painted with streaks of lavender and gold. "Thank you, girl," he whispered. And for a moment, as the wind rustled the pine branches above, he could have sworn he heard the soft thump of a tail, the quiet shuffle of paws beside him. He didn't turn to look. He just smiled. Because some goodbyes never really end. The next morning, Walt was back at Maggie's diner, just like always. Same booth by the window, same chipped mug, same quiet nod to whoever happened to wander in. Life in Elkwood didn't need much fuss to feel full. Just a warm plate, a decent view, and maybe a good story if the weather wasn't too loud. He was mid-sip when a pair of high school kids slid into the booth across from him without asking, local boys, polite enough not to interrupt, but curious enough to lean forward. "Mr. Briggs," one said, "that story yesterday, about the fire? That was real, right?" Walt set down his mug and gave a small smile. "Real as rain," he said. The boys exchanged wide-eyed looks. "And your dog really saved that kid?" "Sadie saved a lot of people," Walt replied. "Some just don't show up on the reports." He glanced out the window. The bronze statue caught the morning light just right, her nose turned toward the hills, like she was still tracking something. Still ready. One of the boys grinned. "Did she ever rescue a cat?" Walt chuckled. once. But not the way you think. The boys leaned in. She chased it straight up a tree on Maple Street, Walt said, shaking his head with a laugh. I spent 2 hours trying to talk her down, and another 3 trying to coax the cat back. By the end, Sadie was asleep at the base of the trunk, snoring like she'd won the lottery. The cat didn't come down until breakfast the next day. The table cracked up, and for a moment the whole diner seemed to lean toward their laughter. Even Maggie looked over from the counter, smiling behind her apron. Walt sat back, arms crossed loosely over his chest. That was Sadie. Brave when it counted, stubborn when it didn't. Just then, a low thud sounded beneath the table. Walt looked down and found a wet tennis ball at his feet, followed by the goofy grin of a golden retriever with one ear flopped sideways and a tail that never quite stopped moving. Well now, he muttered, reaching down to give the dog a scratch behind the ear, you trying to take over the shift? That was Duke, his neighbor's dog technically, but lately more Walt's than anyone else's. He had a habit of wandering into the diner around breakfast time, like he knew where the best bacon scraps were handed out. He's got no sense, Walt told the boys. Can't find his own leash half the time. But he's loyal. And funny. And that counts for something. He tossed the ball, and Duke bounded after it with all the grace of a cow on ice. The boys laughed again, and Walt joined them, slow, deep, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere good. Outside, the breeze stirred the pine needles. Inside, the coffee stayed hot. And Sadie's story lived on, not in sorrow, but in the smiles she left behind. Because some dogs save lives. And some, just by being there, help you live yours a little better.